I'm Charlotte Kahn, an inquisitive Xennial, and in this episode, I'm asking James Brooke-Smith, a previous guest on this show, to come and join me to reminisce about the good old days of rave, Britpop, and cool Britannia. Welcome to Xennials. James, welcome back.
Great to be back.
Absolutely, and we're delighted to have you here with us. But I wanted to spend a bit more time to talk about the place where you grew up and where I live today. It's the UK, because a lot happened during the 1990s here. Britpop, cool Britannia, New Labour, and a thriving art scene with the young British artists, the YBAs, and tech developments with the man who is credited with inventing the internet, Tim Berners-Lee, being British. And we've got Dolly the sheep as well, raves, and the Prodigy, of course. But there's also a darker side because there's a public health scandal concerned with mad cow's disease, for instance. But overall, the 90s here in the UK is a time that's fairly uplifting, isn't it?
So yes, I think parts of the 1990s. Thinking in terms of a whole decade can be misleading, I think. It's worth dividing the 90s into kind of sections and phases, perhaps. Certainly, cool Britannia, New Labour, that kind of cultural energy that many of us feel nostalgic for these days, is very much a product of the mid to late 90s. And Britain at that point became a kind of global icon, if you like. And we got things like the Union Jack on the Spice Girls, on Noel Gallagher's guitar, a kind of almost rebranding of Britain in these kind of youth cultural, optimistic, modernizing terms. But if you go back to the beginning of the 90s in Britain, it's kind of a different world, coming on the heels of a recession. Okay, very high unemployment still from the 1980s, a conservative government, and a much different mood and atmosphere. So the boom of the 90s happens, I think, later on in the decade.
So I have to ask you, were you an Oasis or a Blur fan?
Oasis or Blur?
Yep.
The answer is Pulp.
Okay. I see the 90s in UK as a time where there's a general movement towards levelling up. And maybe that stopped afterwards. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so with the election of Tony Blair's New Labour government, there's a real attempt to at least slow the acceleration of inequality in British society. And New Labour benefit from a booming economy, which we have to acknowledge began under John Major and the Conservatives and is part of global forces as well as just national economic policy. But Tony Blair and Gordon Brown and the New Labour project actively seeks to redistribute some of the wealth of that boom outwards. And there's lots of hospitals built, lots of schools refurbished and built. New Labour can cite as one of their achievements in their first term ending homelessness, ending rough sleeping. So there's a real concerted attempt to address some of the inequalities that had arisen over the course of the Thatcher government in the 1980s.
Tony Blair and New Labour generally embody rupture with the past and this new wind of optimism, which contrasts with the 1980s in the UK, doesn't it?
Yeah, in certain respects, they do constitute a rupture. There's a different style. There's a much more inclusive language that comes out of New Labour about multiculturalism, about a new kind of British identity that's not based on the kind of old symbols of kind of pastoralism and traditional institutions, and is much more about embracing a new, young, multicultural, forward-thinking society and culture. The economical side of it is slightly different, though, I think, because New Labour have modernized their own party and reject the kind of older economic doctrines of the far left. So there's an attempt to redistribute, be progressive, be inclusive, but within a framework or within a new kind of consensus that was formed in the 80s by Thatcher and Reagan.
James, what about this thriving art scene in the UK in the 1990s?
Yeah, so the young British artists in particular make a huge splash both within British culture and around the world. And it's famously focused on the Sensation exhibit at the Saatchi Gallery, and then they fill a space that opened up at the Royal Academy, and then it travels around the world. And the Sensation show is transferred to Brooklyn in New York, and Rudy Giuliani objects to some of the more controversial and challenging pieces, in particular Chris O'Philly's Black Madonna paintings, which use elephant dung in order to depict Black religious female iconography. So there is this kind of dynamism that provokes a scandal, a controversy, a shock. And it's a time when conceptual art is being covered in the tabloid press in fairly kind of confrontational, kind of polemical terms. And I think that was a great thing about the 1990s, this sense that culture mattered and cut through beyond just the gallery into the wider kind of public discourse.
Earlier, I alluded to the fact that New Labour was very much about levelling up and empowering people, but culture is very much about it as well. In fact, a lot of the artists you've mentioned come from a working class background, and I think there was a sense generally in the West, not just in the UK, during the 1990s, that culture was the way forward to help people develop and grow and seize all the opportunities around at the time.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. The kind of idea of the culture industries becomes much more prominent at that point, and culture gets kind of bound up with attempts to regenerate urban spaces in the wake of deindustrialization, and as we move into this new kind of globally connected economy. So lots of Britain's kind of depressed urban spaces are regenerated via cultural development projects, art galleries, in particular, new performance spaces. And the theory is that if you use government funds to build or fund the art space, then you get a kind of economic regeneration around it with restaurants, with entertainment, with shops. So culture is yes, more inclusive, yes, more welcoming, produced by a wider range of people in the 1990s. But it's also part of this kind of social economic development at the same time.
The point of this podcast, Xennials, is not just about dwelling on the past. So I'd like to ask you about the shock tactics of the young British artists, the members of the movement you talked about. There was space for it at the time. Is there space for it now?
Yeah, the way in which what constitutes shock, I think has changed since the 1990s, and who wants to shock. So Damien Hirst, Sarah Lucas, Tracy Emin, Chris O'Philly actively sought to shock with their art. And that shock was aimed at a supposedly conservative opponent, I think. They were trying to shock bourgeois kind of consumerist taste with their depictions of their kind of private lives, their sexuality, their identity. And when the Sensation show transferred to Brooklyn in New York, and Rudy Giuliani turned it into a giant kind of tabloid affair, little warnings, trigger warnings were placed on the artworks and outside, but ironic trigger warnings saying that beware all you who enter here, you might experience shock, destabilization, enjoyment. Okay, so at this point in the late 1990s, it's the progressive leftist artists who are trying to offend people in art galleries. Okay, fast forward 20 years or so, and art is much more respectful, I think, much more scared of giving offense. Okay, much more concerned with making good on repairing the traumas of the past and the inequalities of the past, racial inequalities, gender inequalities. So in a certain sense, we have this kind of more enlightened, progressive art culture. But in another sense, a kind of polite art culture, I miss some of that dynamism, some of that shock, some of that kind of nastiness of 90s YBA art.
I'd like to talk about Xennials themselves, our generation. Since you are a Xennial like me, James, I think that's no secret anymore. Many of today's political and business leaders are Xennials. I'm thinking of Zuckerberg, for instance, of Emmanuel Macron in France, Rishi Sunak here in the UK, or even Zelensky, for instance. How do you view their style of leadership? What's different about them as leaders?
Yeah, this is a great question and a difficult question because it's those people you just mentioned come from all variety of different parties, ideological positions in contemporary culture. They're all young. They all have a fairly casual style in many ways. Politics in the 1990s, a lot of the discourse around New Labour and the New Democrats in the States was about spin and about presentation and about PR, the way in which politics had become much more of a kind of media spectacle. Well, again, fast forward 20 years, and that has only intensified over time with social media, with the constant attention to gaffes and gotchas and missteps. So I think one thing that unites those figures is their great skill and attention to image management. As much as anything. And some of them do it masterfully. Zelensky on the world stage has been masterful at presenting himself and generating support through his performances as much as through his leadership. So I think that's a key concern for Xennial leaders today.
In fact, they've learned those skills during the 1990s, haven't they? Because the decade really signals an era where everything is performed for the camera.
Yeah.
But there's also a more morbid connotation, let's say, to this need to perform for an audience. And there I'm thinking about the Columbine shootings, for instance, or even the September 11th attacks.
Yeah, absolutely. The 90s are a kind of hinge point in so many ways. But one of the things that they usher in is this world of total digital media surveillance, where not only is, the world of pre-1989 and the central state is kind of passing in terms of state surveillance. It's still there, but we get this new world of total self-surveillance in the digital era. And in the 90s, some of the key shifts to that, you mentioned them there, but the rise of reality television is a key moment in the 1990s. Big Brother, takes its name from a dystopian novel. And there is a sense in which in the social media age, we're all living in that kind of dystopian surveillance system where we're all checking our updates, seeing what the feedback is, and this kind of hyper self-awareness about self-presentation and management. And so you talk about the darker side of that, absolutely. The Columbine massacre was a desperate attempt on the part of two resentful little men to be seen on the world media stage. And we're now in the era of live-streamed terrorist events and mass killings, live-streamed on Facebook in Christchurch, New Zealand. And I think many of the kind of new cultural movements that we see in the 2010s and 2020s to do with identity and politics and the kind of, I hate to use the term, but the kind of woke politics is to do with a kind of defense against this mass surveillance, mass comment that we have in this completely plugged in social media landscape.
James, further to this need to present ourselves to different media platforms constantly in our jobs or personal lives, what are the other attributes, qualities, or even weaknesses of Xennials, according to you?
I don't think we have any. No, I'm not going to say that.
We have plenty, of course.
That's a very good question. I think partly we've grown up in a world post-1989 without any real alternative to neoliberal economics. And I think maybe that world is going to come into being soon, but while Tony Blair and Bill Clinton managed to shift the dial to a certain extent, we've lived in a world of increasing inequality for much of our lifetimes and increasing precariousness for especially young people coming through today. So I think we've kind of bought into, in many respects, that kind of aspirational, professional kind of world, in spite of our subcultural identifications as young people. And I think young people today are much more disaffected with that economic system that we've done pretty well out of.
But there was a fair dose of cynicism and angst amongst us growing up in the 90s. I remember anti-WTO demonstrations, for instance. In the previous podcast, we talked about the different musical genres of the time, grunge, for instance, or heavy metal. I mean, they were not exactly very upbeat manifestations of how we felt about the decade. So there was some dissatisfaction brewing during the 90s.
Absolutely. There's a kind of misconception about the 1990s as being apolitical in some way. Perhaps in comparison to earlier decades, earlier generations, we certainly didn't have our May 68 moment. Nevertheless, certainly in terms of anti-globalization movements on the streets in Seattle and Genoa and elsewhere, when I was a kid, I remember as a teenager, the big kind of protest movement was against road development and bypasses, which is part of a burgeoning environmental consciousness at the same time. So whilst many of those movements didn't have traction at that point within political parties and within governments, I think they feed into a longer line of kind of protest and discontent that gets manifested in Occupy and in many of the movements today. So yeah, I think the 90s were disaffected and politicized as well.
To conclude with, James, I mean, it's fascinating to talk to you, and I'm going to resist the temptation to invite you for a third podcast. So I have to ask you the following question. Why did you want to write a history of the 90s? What prompted you to do it?
Yeah, getting old, being nostalgic.
Midlife crisis?
Midlife crisis, wanting to relive my youth in the form of a large history book. That's slightly a strange way to go about it. But also my growing sense that the 90s were becoming history. What was current affairs, lived experience, was being kind of churned under by a new wave of events, new trends, new styles, new people. So I wanted to kind of go back with a different perspective on it. I also had a very strange experience teaching British cinema in a Canadian university, teaching a class on train spotting and discussing it with my students. And then I had a student come to my office afterwards, tell me how much he enjoyed the class and how much he loved train spotting and how much he loved the music of that era and how he loved Oasis and Pulp and Blur. And I told him that I'd been to watch Oasis when I was a kid in Wolverhampton in the 1990s. And he was kind of struck and he said, "It's amazing that you got to see all those classic rock bands." And so it had this kind of crushing sense of awareness that what I saw as kind of fun but quite retro at the time has now become old man's rock music. So it's that sense of generational change made me want to go back and reconsider and rethink about it.
I can relate to that. I went to watch Guns N' Roses twice in the past 3 years. James, it was so good to have you back on Xennials. Thank you so much. I'd like to remind the audience that James is the author of this absolutely brilliant book on the 1990s called Accelerate, A History of the 90s. Very informative. I absolutely loved it. James, thank you so much.
Thank you.